In a packed federal courtroom in downtown Chicago, nobody expected a Tuesday morning hearing to turn into a headline war zone. The air already felt heavy, security tighter than usual, murmurs louder than prayer, phones vibrating like heartbeat monitors in every pocket. Lil Durk, dressed in a muted charcoal suit with shades that hid more than eyes, sat still. Too still. The kind of stillness that means someone is calculating every second, every sound, every exit. Prosecutors had promised new evidence, but promises are cheap in rap trials. Bombshells, those are rare, until today, when the government laptop connected to the courtroom speakers, a hush swallowed the room whole. Then came the audio. A distorted but chilling voice, allegedly an FBI wiretap pulled from a confidential source, echoed through the silence. The transcript monitors flickered as the voice said names that hit like thunder. Durk, no, the play, Von started it, Asian doll got the drop. Gasps erupted like flash grenades, journalists stopped breathing, fans in the public gallery clutched their chests. One woman whispered, "Nah, not Von," like she had just seen a ghost sit up and testify. King Von's name being spoken in a federal case is already emotional dynamite. Posthumous mentions carry a different weight, heavier because the person can't defend, explain, or deny. But this wasn't just a mention, this sounded like blame, context, narrative, accusation, and then Asian doll's name followed, raw, personal, and dangerously close to betrayal territory. Her fans online had always painted her as Von's voice after his silence, his legacy in motion. But legacies crack when the courtroom speaks before the streets do. The audio kept rolling, each sentence more inflammatory than the last, dragging old alliances into new suspicion and turning public grief into legal leverage. The defense table exchanged glances sharp enough to slice glass. One attorney leaned toward Durk, whispering with visible urgency while Durk's jaw ticked, a subtle tremor that cameras zoomed into like predators spotting movement. Outside the courthouse, fans already began filming reaction videos, live streams titled "Feds Wild for This," and hashtags brewing like digital riots. The city of drill music was about to collide with the city of federal law and the impact zone, the culture itself. Everyone had walked into court expecting arguments. Nobody expected a reckoning. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was ready for the FBI to narrate Chicago drill history through a courtroom speaker. But here we were, history wasn't just being referenced. It was being remixed, weaponized, and broadcast live for the world to judge, and the chaos had only just begun. The moment the audio stopped, the courtroom didn't explode right away. It froze. That kind of silence where even the air feels scared to move. The judge adjusted his glasses slowly, buying time, like he already knew this was about to get messy. Lil Durk didn't look back at the gallery, didn't look at the press, didn't even look at the screen where his name had just been dragged into a federal narrative. He stared straight ahead, jaw locked, hands folded like a man trying to hold his entire past still with his fingers. Then the whispers started, quiet at first, then stacking on top of each other like falling dominoes. Reporters leaned toward their recorders. A blogger in the back mouthed, "This is crazy," without even realizing the mic in front of her was live. Fans who had camped outside since sunrise felt their stomachs drop because this wasn't the kind of update you tweet through with laughing emojis. This felt heavy, final, dangerous. The prosecutor stood up again, calm in that unsettling way that only comes from rehearsing a moment like this 100 times. He cleared his throat and said the words everyone hates hearing. "Your Honor, this audio is only a small portion of what the government intends to introduce." Small portion, that phrase hit harder than the audio itself. Because if this was small, what was coming next? Durk's lead attorney shot to his feet immediately, objecting before the prosecutor could even finish the sentence. His voice cracked just slightly, not from fear but from controlled anger. He argued the tape was misleading, spliced, taken out of context, and designed to poison public perception rather than establish facts. He said names were being used like weapons, especially the name of someone who was no longer alive to defend himself. When he said King Von's name out loud, there was an audible reaction in the room, a mix of pain and pride. Because Von isn't just a rapper to his fans, he's memory, mythology, street scripture. The judge called for order, his gavel hitting wood harder than necessary. But order was already gone. Because outside the courtroom, the internet had caught fire. Clips of the audio leaked within minutes, chopped into 15-second soundbites with captions screaming, "FBI really said this?" Reaction videos stacked up faster than anyone could count. Some fans were in denial, calling it fake, AI-generated, or straight-up fed propaganda. Others were quieter, more uneasy, replaying the clip again and again, trying to hear anything that sounded less incriminating. And then Asian Doll's name started trending. For years, she had carried herself like a guardian of Von's legacy, speaking his name with both love and fury, defending his honor online like it was a full-time job. Now that same loyalty was being twisted into suspicion. People dug up old interviews, old tweets, old lives, reading everything differently. Fans slowed down videos, analyzed her tone, her pauses, her emotions like amateur detectives. Emotions ran high and lines were drawn fast. Support on one side, betrayal accusations on the other. Inside the courthouse hallway during a brief recess, Durk's family gathered close. His mother stayed quiet, eyes fixed on the floor, lips moving in silent prayer. One cousin paced back and forth, muttering about how the feds always wait, always watch, always strike when you think the storm passed. Nobody smiled. Nobody joked. This wasn't a case anymore, it was survival. A reporter caught up with a longtime family friend who whispered off the record that Durk had expected pressure, but not this angle. "They bringing ghosts into this," he said. "How you fight a story when they let the dead talk?" That line made it into 3 different blogs within the hour. Back inside, the prosecution doubled down, hinting that the audio was part of a broader timeline they were building. A timeline that, according to them, connected lyrics, phone calls, street rumors, and real-world consequences. They spoke like storytellers, not lawyers, weaving emotion and implication together until the room felt less like a courtroom and more like a true crime documentary filming live. Durk finally leaned toward his attorney and whispered something sharp enough to make the attorney nod instantly. When Durk looked up again, his eyes were cold, focused, not scared, not confused, angry. The kind of anger that comes from feeling misunderstood by people who already made up their minds. During the lunch break, fans outside argued openly. One group insisted this was the system trying to rewrite Chicago drill history and pin it on the biggest surviving name. Another group admitted quietly that the streets had always talked about things the music never fully said. Friendships ended in real time on live streams. Creators unfollowed each other mid-broadcast. Emotions ran high and nobody trusted anyone's take. Asian Doll broke her silence online with a vague post that didn't mention names but didn't need to. Clout is one thing, lies are another. God see everything? Within minutes, the comments turned brutal. Support mixed with accusations, heart emojis drowned out by snake emojis. The family of King Von stayed silent, but that silence spoke loudly. Fans read into it, speculated, argued. The family was left divided in the public eye, even if privately they were just trying to breathe. When court resumed, the judge warned both sides about media influence, but it was already too late. The case had escaped the building. It was in phones, bedrooms, group chats, and timelines across the world. This wasn't just about guilt or innocence anymore. It was about narrative. About who gets to tell the story of a culture that already feels hunted. As the day ended, Durk stood to leave, surrounded by marshals. He paused for half a second, glanced toward the gallery, and locked eyes with a young fan who had followed his career since the mixtape days. No words were exchanged, but the look said everything. Confusion, loyalty, fear, hope, all tangled together. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. Questions were shouted. Durk said nothing. Asian Doll posted nothing else. And King Von's name echoed everywhere, louder than it had in years. The feds had dropped their first bomb, and whether it was truth, strategy, or spectacle, one thing was clear: the story was no longer just being told by the streets. It was being argued in court, and the fallout was only beginning. The second half of the day carried a different kind of tension, heavier, slower, more psychological. The courthouse had become a pressure cooker, and every person inside knew the steam wasn't coming from the lawyers, it was coming from the culture sitting at the defense table. Lil Durk walked back in after lunch with no entourage swagger, no music video posture, just a man bracing for impact. The kind of impact you can't duck with bars, streams, or street reputation. The prosecution didn't rush this time, they let the anticipation marinate. Strategic silence is a legal seasoning and the feds sprinkle it like professionals. When the prosecutor finally opened his folder, the gallery leaned forward like they were being pulled by invisible strings. He began laying out a story that sounded too cinematic for government work. He talked about Chicago drill like it was a case study, a living organism of loyalty, retaliation, grief, and misinterpretation. He didn't say rap beef, he said cultural fault lines. He didn't say gang affiliations, he said informal power networks. Every phrase was dressed up in legal silk, but everyone could see the street stitches underneath. He played no new audio yet. Instead, he read between the lines of the first tape, dissecting intent like a surgeon working without a scalpel. He implied Durk's calmness wasn't innocence, it was conditioning. The defense snapped back that calmness under scrutiny is not a crime, that silence is not conspiracy, and that emotional As Durk packed his notes to leave for the day, a reporter tried to get a quote. "Mr. Banks, does this audio change anything for you?" Durk paused. Not long, just long enough for the moment to feel intentional. He turned slightly, looked at the reporter, not through him, at him, and said quietly, "Stories ain't charges." 4 words, no theatrics, no aggression, no emotion spilled. But the message was seismic. Stories ain't charges. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't posture. He dropped a philosophical pebble into a media ocean and let the ripples handle the rest. Within minutes, that quote was everywhere. Not in all caps, not dramatized, not edited, just raw, because raw travels faster than loud these days. Fans outside erupted again, but this time with a different chant. "Stories ain't charges." It became a slogan, a shield. A meme, a battle cry, not legal but cultural. Asian Doll liked one post with that quote, and that single digital tap lit up 10,000 more interpretations. Analysts claimed her like was support. Skeptics said it was positioning. Haters said it was damage control. Nobody asked her. The internet already appointed itself spokesperson. As the courtroom emptied, the story stayed behind, buzzing in the ether like unresolved feedback in a speaker after the mic is unplugged. The culture walked out of that building carrying more questions than answers, more implications than evidence, and more emotional investment than any government affidavit could ever document cleanly. And that was the point. The feds had successfully turned a hearing into a cultural referendum, a public trial inside a legal one, and a legacy debate stitched into a wiretap echo. The music world, the streets, the timelines, and the fan galleries were now all co-defendants in a narrative nobody could fully own or fully escape. The storm was just warming up. Chicago drill had been built on echoes, now those echoes were testifying back. The next morning the fallout didn't just continue, it evolved. It was no longer courtroom shock value, it was culture under a microscope and everyone trying to zoom in from a different lens. Chicago woke up like a city that hadn't slept, like someone left the aux cord plugged into a federal database overnight and the playlist became evidence by sunrise. News trucks already parked outside before the courthouse lights fully flickered on. Fans weren't gathering anymore, they were forming alliances, digital coalitions with theory threads longer than indictment pages. Lil Durk's team had spent the night doing what lawyers rarely admit they do: reputation triage. Not legal defense, public defense. When a man is on trial in a genre that thrives on street authenticity, perception becomes a second jury, one that deliberates with likes, shares, comment wars, and anonymous audio analysis. Durk himself wasn't tweeting, but his absence was louder than any statement. Archie Goodwin once said silence is a tactic, but Archie never met the 2025 algorithm where silence becomes a green screen for speculation. Durk's legal advisors knew if they didn't shape the narrative would shape them, and the public gallery was already drafting its own version of truth like fan fiction with subpoena power. Overnight, a snippet of a second alleged audio file leaked, not played in court, just whispered across Telegram channels, Reddit forums, YouTube comment trenches. The clip was even rougher, glitchier, but one line stood out like a flare in fog: "They love you till the case love you more." Nobody could verify it, but verification wasn't needed. The phrase carried enough poetry to feel real. Enough threat to feel federal, enough street logic to feel drill-coded. The blogs ran with it, tagging Durk, tagging Vaughn, tagging Asian Doll, tagging a cultural autopsy that hadn't even officially begun yet. The prosecution was irritated not because it leaked but because they didn't leak it first. Feds hate competition when it comes to narrative control. They prefer their evidence airtight but their storytelling breathable, leaving just enough room for the public to suffocate itself with assumptions. A high-ranking official even told a reporter off the record that rap trials are psychological operations now. Psychological operations. Like they were studying not just crimes but influence, grief, loyalty, digital trigger points, community fault lines. Emotions ran high before court even resumed. Because the feds weren't just trying a man, they were trying a movement that has always blurred between documentary and myth. Durk walked into court again that day wearing a black puffer jacket, this time designer but subtle. No logos screaming, no diamonds blinding. His legal team wanted relatability, not provocation. Prosecutors want villains, defense wants humans. The judge glanced at him like he could feel the shift. The hallway murmurs were now about strategy, not shock. Durk passed fans outside who chanted his slogan back at him, "Stories ain't charges." But this time it sounded less like a meme, more like a mantra, a psychological barricade against the federal remix machine. Inside, Asian Doll's impact was everywhere without her physically being there. Bloggers kept pulling up her old interviews on courtroom-adjacent screens in the hallway. "Loyalty is louder than bullets," she once said in a 2023 live. Now people were replaying it like testimony. Her quotes were being used by both sides. Fans to defend her, bloggers to suspect her, prosecutors to contextualize her, defense to humanize her. The internet doesn't preserve nuance, it preserves moments. She had a lot of moments. Now moments were turning into exhibits in the court of public opinion. King Von's name had taken on a life beyond the tape. In drill culture, the dead don't get quieter, they get remixed into meaning. But federal court is the one place where meaning can turn into motive, and motive can turn into inference, and inference can turn into pressure, and pressure can turn into plea leverage. Von's family still hadn't spoken publicly, but private sources claimed they were furious. Furious not because of truth, but because of tone. The streets built Von into legend, the court was trying to frame him into context. Context is the enemy of legend. Legend thrives on echo, not explanation. The prosecutor finally introduced documents, not audio, a slow burn tactic. Phone pings, location charts, old affiliate testimonies, timelines that connected studio sessions, city movements, Instagram interactions, old street rumor cycles that were never meant to be evidence but now were being repurposed into inference scaffolding. They painted a mosaic that looked like drill culture if drill culture had a federal case manager. Fans in the gallery looked uneasy again because mosaics don't lie but storytellers choose the tiles. Defense countered by pointing out selective assembly. "You can build a timeline out of anything if you only include the parts that look guilty," Durk's lawyer said. The judge nodded slightly, not in agreement, just acknowledgement. Judges rarely intervene in narrative wars, they intervene in legal ones. But narrative wars decide reputations before evidence does, and this reputation had global shareholders. Outside, Durk's quote had mutated into new variations. T-shirts popped up outside the courthouse within hours reading "Stories ain't charges" on the front and "Echoes ain't evidence" on the back. Merch moves faster than marshals. Cultural slogans move faster than verdicts. Prosecutors weren't happy. Because slogans complicate plea negotiations. It's harder to get a man to bend when the streets are handing him spine braces disguised as memes. During another recess, Durk finally stood up, stretched his legs slowly. A journalist thought he might say something. Durk didn't speak to the journalist. He spoke to the room, not loud, calm, intentional. "They don't know me, they know the story of me." A statement like that wasn't emotional spill, it was philosophical shrapnel. The gallery felt it, bloggers felt it, prosecutors hated it. Because philosophical statements don't defend charges, they defend identity, and identity defense is jury immune but culture lethal. Fans are shocked again, but this time with pride. Bloggers were conflicted. Prosecutors were adjusting their folders. The judge finally announced that the trial would continue with tighter media restrictions on evidence previews, but restrictions don't stop leaks. Leaks don't stop theories. Theories don't stop merch. Merch doesn't stop legacy debates. The family was left divided wasn't just a phrase now, it was the condition of an entire fan ecosystem trying to reconcile grief, loyalty, federal implication, cultural myth, and digital identity defense. The court wanted facts. The streets wanted narrative sovereignty. The internet wanted villains, philosophers, memes, betrayal arcs, pressure cookers, and new audio lines to analyze like ancient scripture. Lil Durk was stuck between all three arenas, trying to remind the world that stories can be clipped, but charges must be proven, and proving a story is not the same as proving a crime. And in a culture built on echoes, everyone was now asking a new question. If the feds own the audio but the streets own the meaning, who owns the truth when both sides remix history through speakers? Nobody had the answer. But everyone was watching. The final stretch of the trial week felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a cultural collision course that nobody could pause, edit, or mute. The courthouse lights glared like interrogation lamps, the kind that don't ask questions, they demand emotional receipts. Chicago drill culture had never been neat, but federal narratives demand neatness even when the streets thrive on chaos. And chaos had officially entered Discovery. Durk's demeanor had subtly shifted again, not into panic, but into that zone where a man realizes he's not fighting accusations, he's fighting the architecture of implication itself. He still wasn't tweeting, but that vacuum had become a black hole for commentary. Fans online kept refreshing his profile like waiting for a pulse, but pulses are human, narratives are algorithmic, and algorithms were feasting. Bloggers had turned the courtroom into a 24/7 theory arena. Every silence, every sigh, every attorney lean-in was being translated into motive charts by people who have never read a legal brief but have mastered the virality brief. The prosecution finally played a third alleged audio clip, even though the authenticity was still disputed. The distortion sounded like city static fighting for frequency, but one line stood out clean enough to travel. "Loyalty is your currency till the court audits it." The gallery flinched. Because loyalty is sacred in drill, but audits are sacred in federal court. Sacred things can coexist, but they rarely survive each other. The prosecutor leaned into the moment, adding that the culture keeps canonizing loyalty without verifying its cost. Defense fired back that culture isn't required to footnote trauma, that survival music can't be used as a balance sheet without context credits. Asian Doll still hadn't physically appeared, but spiritually, digitally, emotionally, she was omnipresent. Fans had dug up old tweets of hers where she once said, "I speak in metaphors because truth is hunted in Chicago." Now that same sentence was being twisted into suspicion. If truth is hunted, does that make her the hunter or the witness? Haters ran one angle, fans ran another. The family of King Von stayed silent publicly, but insiders said their group chat was a war room of grief and frustration. Grief not because they believed the tape, but because the tape was trying to claim ownership of a legacy they built from loss, not prosecution. One moment the media clipped like wildfire was Durk quietly telling his attorney, "They want a villain who writes. I'm a writer who survived villains." The mic didn't catch it perfectly, but lips are easy to read in 4,000 slow-mo, and slow-mo is the Bible of online speculation. That quote went everywhere, chopped into edits with dramatic background music, narrated like prophecy. Bloggers love philosophers when philosophers refuse to be anchors. Prosecutors hate philosophy because philosophy complicates inference. And inference was their entire strategy. Court artists were sketching Durk like a man sitting between heaven and headlines don't forgive nuance. Fans outside started chanting again, but this time with a darker twist. "Echoes ain't evidence?" The slogan evolved from defense logic to cultural protest. The courthouse steps became a studio for public trial clips, people debating if lyrics, love, legacy, loyalty, rumors, pings, voices, ghosts, and glitchy audio should be treated like evidence or autobiography. Autobiography can be ugly, but ugly isn't illegal. The prosecution wanted the public to confuse ugly with actionable. Defense wanted the public to remember that actionable needs proof, not poetry. The judge finally intervened, not by silencing the audio, but by silencing its pre-release narrative scaffolding. He ruled that any future clips must be vetted internally before being played, and warned both sides that media leaks were turning legal momentum into cultural distortion. Cultural distortion? The phrase echoed like feedback in a speaker, but feedback had been Chicago's signature long before FBI signatures entered the chat. Durk stood up at the end of the hearing not to make a statement, but to collect his coat. A small movement, but movements are oxygen for virality. A reporter shouted, "Do you feel betrayed by the mentions?" Durk didn't answer the reporter. He answered the question itself, quietly enough to feel personal, loud enough to trend. Betrayal is human. Narratives are engineered. Don't confuse the two. Engineered narratives, engineered audio, engineered inference mosaics. The prosecution had tried to engineer history. The defense tried to engineer clarity. The streets tried to engineer legacy sovereignty, and the internet engineered everything into content. By the end of the day, Chicago drill culture had realized it wasn't being prosecuted for actions, it was being prosecuted for influence, implication, grief ownership, and narrative authority. Durk wasn't fighting King Von or Asian Doll or the tape itself. He was fighting the belief that stories prove crimes, that loyalty proves orchestration, that grief proves intent, that echoes prove coordination, and that influence is automatically incriminating. Influence is not illegal, inference is not proof, and proof is the one thing the feds hadn't fully introduced yet. Fans were emotionally exhausted but philosophically armed. Bloggers were narratively invested but evidentially confused. Prosecutors were irritated but strategically patient. Von's family was quiet but internally boiling. Asian Doll's fans were defending her legacy like digital soldiers guarding a museum built out of livestream fragments. Durk's fans were defending his humanity like emotional philosophers with wife. The family was left divided had become more than a phrase. It was the condition of the entire drill ecosystem trying to reconcile legend with litigation, grief with inference, loyalty with audits, stories with charges, echoes with evidence, influence with intent, and love with courtroom acoustics. The culture didn't want sympathy, it wanted ownership of its own voice. And for the first time in drill history, everyone was realizing when the dead are named in court, they don't get a defense attorney, they get a legacy debate. Debate is not proof, but proof wasn't the story anymore. The story was who gets to remix history when history can't speak for itself without distortion. And the world was watching the distortion louder than the charges because the charges weren't just legal anymore. They were cultural, psychological, digital, engineered, audited, echoed, remixed, and unresolved. And that unresolved frequency was exactly where the public gallery lived now, between echo and evidence, waiting to see who owns the aux cord when the court and the streets fight for the same speaker. The trial would continue, but the cultural verdict was already looping, clipped into content, argued into slogans, audited into loyalty charts, and remixed into a question no gavel could silence. When influence is treated like evidence, does culture become co-defendant or eyewitness? The courthouse didn't answer. The streets didn't answer. The internet already thought it had. After days of audio leaks, objections, slogans, and legacy debates, one thing is clear. This case is no longer just a trial, it's a cultural storm playing out in real time. The FBI tapes may be distorted, disputed, or dissected like puzzle pieces, but the emotional impact has been crystal clear. Lil Durk is fighting more than accusations, he's fighting the remixing of history itself. King Von's name being pulled into federal dialogue has reopened wounds that never fully healed, and Asian Doll's loyalty is now being judged by fans who treat every like, every quote, every silence like a hidden verse. Emotions ran high, the internet stayed divided, and Chicago drill once again found itself caught between legend and litigation. There are still unanswered questions hanging in the air like static in a broken courtroom speaker. Were the audio strategy or truth? Is the system trying to rewrite the drill timeline? Can a man be guilty of influence alone when influence is the language of his environment? Narratives can be engineered, but charges need proof, and proof is the one currency nobody has seen fully cashed in yet. The family was left divided may be a phrase, but division has become the condition not just for the courtroom, but for the fans, the blogs, and the legacy holders watching from every corner of the world. Now it's your turn to step into the conversation. You're not just watching the story, you're part of the culture that decides how stories travel. Hit like if you felt the shock. Subscribe if you want every twist as it drops. And most importantly, get in those comments and tell the world what you think the truth really sounds like when the speakers are fighting for ownership. Second jury is already in session, and your voice matters more than you know. Don't just scroll past the chaos, weigh in on it, because the timeline is watching you watch it.